harbour. On the other hand, she may have been heading northeast to try to bring the task force to battle. Either way, the Argentine admiral's plans were wrecked by a couple of tigerfish torpedoes. The General Belgrano is an old-fashioned warship, which means she has a 4-inch belt of armour plating along the waterline. It was probably that which saved her from being sunk. But the internal damage caused will have been enormous, and it'll take months of dockyard repairs to make her seaworthy again. Meanwhile, to the north, the Argentine naval commander on the Falklands was making a courageous attempt to discover the whereabouts of the Hermes. 2 naval auxiliary patrol boats, the same pair which broke the blockade in a much publicised dash into Port Stanley a fortnight ago, sailed north. Although they're only lightly armed with a pair of Oerlikon cannon, their job was to scout and radio back information on anything they saw. But the pair was spotted on radar by a Royal Navy Sea King helicopter. The Sea King itself had also been located by the patrol boats, and they opened fire. So the Sea King withdrew to a safe distance, and 2 Lynx helicopters, apparently armed with the new Sea Skewer missile, were launched by one of the destroyers, escorting the Hermes. The Lynxes fired their missiles from well beyond the range of the patrol boat's guns. They sank one and damaged the other. By knocking out the General Belgrano, Admiral Woodward has now effectively reduced naval opposition to 6 warships, 3 submarines, 1 aircraft carrier, and 2 modern Type 42 destroyers. Any of those ships can cause havoc to the troop convoy, however, especially the submarines.
In Buenos Aires, Argentine military sources are reported as saying they did not know anything about the helicopter attack on the patrol craft. But the Argentines have admitted that their cruiser had been torpedoed and have said that other ships were going to her assistance. From Buenos Aires, here's Christopher Morris.
The military junta claims that the British submarine attacked the Argentine cruiser outside the 200-mile exclusion zone declared by both countries around the Falkland Islands. A brief communique by the junta confirmed the attack on the General Belgrano, saying that the cruiser had been damaged by a torpedo. However, no other details were given, whether there'd been any Argentine casualties or how serious the damage was. Other Argentine warships are reported to have gone to the area to see if any assistance is required by the General Belgrano, the Navy's only cruiser commissioned 43 years ago and bought from the United States in 1951 for nearly £4 million. There's been no confirmation of the other encounter in which British helicopters are reported to have sunk one Argentine patrol boat and damaged another 50 miles inside the exclusion zone. And the official communiques here continue to claim, after Saturday's British attacks, a triumph of the Argentine forces, with the British fleet supposedly badly beaten and said to be moving away from the islands.
For the first time, BBC radio broadcasts to Latin America are being jammed by the Argentines. A 4-hour program in Spanish, which began at 1 a.m. and included a number of news bulletins, was repeatedly jammed. BBC engineers say they're certain the jamming comes from Argentina.
The Argentine claims that the bombardment of the airfield at Port Stanley at the weekend did no damage have now been answered with photographic proof from British pilots. Our reporter on the flagship Hermes has seen the photographs of Port Stanley runway taken by Sea Harriers which followed up the Vulcan bomber raid.
I've seen the reconnaissance photographs of the airfield at Stanley, and they leave no doubt that damage has been done. There's a row of holes from the Vulcan bomber bisecting the runway, and craters from the Sea Harriers attack running along it. The pilot of one of the Harriers has also shown me the photographs he took during his bombing run. They show him coming round to fly across the runway as he released his bomb load. One of the other Harrier pilots, who was in the first wave of the attack, stayed behind to watch the others. His pictures show a group of cluster bombs exploding close to the runway. These bombs are designed to penetrate aircraft, radar installations, and even lightly armored vehicles. Anything in their vicinity would have been damaged.
The Foreign Secretary, Mr. Pym, is due to fly back from New York later today following his talks with the United Nations Secretary-General, Mr. Pérez de Cuéllar. Although Britain has not ruled out a possible role for the UN as a mediator, no firm proposals appear to have come from either party. This report on the talks by Michael Cole.
It was the Foreign Secretary's first meeting with the United Nations Secretary-General. Mr. Pym had to begin the meeting by informing him of the British attack on the Argentine cruiser. Mr. Perez de Cuellar explained the various roles which the UN could play. Britain is not excluding UN involvement, but not immediately. For his part, Mr. Pym made clear there was no question of accepting a so-called Peruvian peace plan. Suggestions originating in Peru were among several being considered. After 3 hours of talks, Mr. Pym was doubtful that the meeting with the Secretary-General would lead to immediate diplomatic moves.
I doubt that, but by exploring it very carefully with Mr. Hague, whose an original negotiation has come to an end, but whose total attempt to find a diplomatic solution, certainly in my view, has not come to an end. And by talking with the Secretary-General of the United Nations tonight and exploring the ground for the first time with him, I feel progress has been made, but not in the sense of producing any specific result. And let me say that the British forces, the task force, is in the South Atlantic to back up and to support our negotiations. And we declared several days ago and gave notice that we intended to secure the total exclusion zone. And the military operations that have occurred in the last couple of days are wholly related to the need for us to secure that zone.
So no change in the uncompromising British position, no slackening in the determination to maintain the military and economic pressure while seeking a diplomatic solution. And that's the message Mr. Pym will convey to the President of the Security Council here at the United Nations later today, before returning to London by Concorde.
At home, the future of all-party talks between Mrs. Thatcher and the leaders of the opposition parties remained in doubt today after Mr. Foot's refusal to attend. Mr. David Steele for the Liberals and Dr. David Owen for the Social Democrats have accepted the offer. But Mr. Foot has said no, apparently feeling it would hamper his freedom to speak his mind in the Commons. Mrs. Thatcher now has to make up her mind whether to go ahead. She'll be returning to Downing Street this afternoon after spending the weekend at Chequers. Reporting now on political developments, here's David Koss.
A decision on the three-party talks is possible this afternoon. The division between the two sides in the House of Commons is not likely to deepen over the latest naval engagements. All party leaders agree that action taken in self-defence is necessary to protect British sailors and soldiers. When MPs return tomorrow after the holiday break, the argument's likely to be over how deeply the United Nations should become in any attempt to search for a diplomatic solution. Mr. Pym seems to think that at present its role is peripheral. Government spokesmen in London this morning were stressing the big question marks which hung over any UN involvement, including a possible Soviet veto on action and the slowness of the organisation. Labour leaders, however, basing their views on what Dennis Healey found when he went to New York, consider that the UN could be useful at present. And while Labour may well accept that the operation against Port Stanley Airport was necessary for self-defence, they're less convinced that it should have been launched as a tightening of the screw on Argentina.
Finally, a reminder that Britain's top luxury cruise liner, the QE2, has been requisitioned and will be used for transporting more troops to the South Atlantic. 5 infantry brigade are ready to help the task force. They've just finished a period of training. 2 more roll-on, roll-off ferries are also being requisitioned. The QE2 is due in Southampton at midnight tonight after a cruise from the United States. The Ministry of Defence say they greatly regret any inconvenience caused to those booked on the ship in the near future, but they say she is uniquely suited to carry a substantial number of troops and keep them at readiness over a period of time.
And just a few minutes ago, our Bill Hamilton managed to get through on the telephone to talk to the QE2's captain. And he asked him when he first heard about the news that she was being requisitioned.
Well, Mr. Hamilton, I've just heard from you this very minute.
This is the first you've heard about it?
Yes. I haven't heard anything from anywhere else.
Well, the ministry say that they would like her to carry 5 infantry brigades to the South Atlantic. Do you think she would be suitable for this purpose?
Well, if the ministry thinks so, I'm sure she must be. It's a total surprise to me. I hadn't even considered it.
Do you think it would entail much conversion work?
Oh, I'm sure it would entail some, yes.
And how long do you think it would take the QE2 to reach the South Atlantic?
Oh, my word, it's quite a long distance away. I should think somewhere in the region of about, 10 days or so. That's off the top of my head, of course, but I was thinking somewhere about that.
Do you think you would be prepared to captain the ship on this?
Well, sorry, we've interrupted that because I've just been told in my earpiece that we've received another report from our correspondent, Brian Hanrahan, who's aboard HMS Hermes. I hope we can bring it to you now.
The cruiser had been operating outside Britain's 200-mile exclusion zone for several days. When it entered it last night, a nuclear submarine torpedoed it. It hasn't been sunk, but it has been damaged. The attack was selective. The cruiser's escorts were allowed to escape. The General Belgrano was an old World War II cruiser. It had 15 heavy guns and a crew of more than 1,000 to man them. Despite its firepower, it was perhaps the least worrying of the serious threats to the task force. Because of its age, it would make a great deal of noise in the water, an easy trace for Britain's nuclear submarines, which have been on station here for some time. The other exchange came at 3 a.m. when a Sea King helicopter discovered an Argentine tug patrolling within the zone. The tug attacked the helicopter with a machine gun. Lynx helicopters with the latest radar-guided missile, the Sea Skua, attacked and sunk the tug. HMS Hermes put out a general distress message for aid to the survivors. About 2 hours later, a second tug was discovered, attacked and damaged with missiles. The task force has now dealt heavy blows at both the Argentine Navy and Air Force, as well as bombing and damaging the airport at Port Stanley. It's shown that it can enforce the sea and air blockade of the islands that Admiral Woodward, the commander, said he intended to establish. This demonstrates to the troops ashore that they cannot expect much in the way of reinforcement or help from the mainland if they decide to resist any British invasion. With winter closing in, much will now depend on what supplies and shelter they have managed to bring across to the island in the few weeks since they invaded. Brian Hanrahan, BBC, aboard HMS Hermes.
And that late report ends News Afternoon. Our next scheduled news with Richard Baker is at 6 o'clock, when we'll have the latest reports from other BBC correspondents covering the conflict. Of course, if there are any major developments during the afternoon, we'll have special reports from them. Moira Stewart and I will be back tomorrow at 12:30.